Hello, welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with The Bad Seed, Chapter 8. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Breedlove entered the Penmark apartment in her usual aggressive, effervescent manner. She had been shopping. She sank down in the first chair she saw, saying, "I bought both of us a little present. It's something I've wanted for a long time, but I can never find before. I know you'd wanted one too, because your kitchen is just like mine." It was a soap dish to be fashioned above the kitchen sink. "You don't have to put drill holes in the tiles to top it off," she said. "It fastens the tiles by suction." She exhibits the suction cup and continued, You coat the inside with castor oil of our things and slap it on tiles with a firm, quick motion. It sticks like it was nailed on there." But Mrs. Penmark was still under the shock of what she'd recently heard from her child, and she'd listened to Monica in a withdrawn silence, smiling vaguely, nodding her head at regular intervals, and hearing little her guest said. Mrs. Breedlove fanned herself and went on. "The arrogance of salespeople never ceases to amaze me. When I bought the dishes, the mailman said, 'I'd better show you how to put it up, madam.' And so I said, 'My dear man, I can read a bit, I assure you. The directions are plainly printed on the card.' And then he smirked in that superior men effect, particularly when other men are around listening, and said, 'Ladies aren't good when it comes to mechanical things. My wife can't even screw in a light bulb to keep it straight.' And so I said, 'I dare say I can fix anything you or any other man can fix. And what's more, it wouldn't surprise me if I couldn't fix a lot of things you can't fix.'" She talked on and on in a pleased, hearty voice, repeating the things she said to the salesman and the things he had said to her. Mrs. Penmark smiled in agreement and sat with her hands so insert in her lap that already they seemed to have some of her realistic everyday power. Mrs. Breedlove's story came to her vaguely, not on thing as itself, but only as a background for her own thoughts, for her mind when it was still on the problem of Rhoda and what to do next. Should she go to the police and confess things her child had done? Was that the best solution? Of course, it wasn't likely a child so young would be arrested and tried for murder, but certainly they'd take her away and put her in an institution. "We used to call them reform schools," she thought, nodding and smiling reassuringly in Monica's direction. "But I'm not sure if they still call them that." "Now, when I was a young girl," said Monica with determined good nature, "I had an older brother who later died of scarlet fever. He was named for my father, Michael Lanier Wages, and he was very bright. I remember people saying when I was small and so timid I'd run off and hide if a stranger so much as spoke to me. How lucky it is, Mrs. Wages, that if one of the children had to be stupid, it was the girl. It doesn't matter how dull a girl is, she always find herself a good provider and make get out all right. In fact, it's probably an advantage for her to be a little stupid. But a boy's got to be smart if he expects to get any place in the world." She paused and glanced at Christine, and Mrs. Penmark, who had heard little what she said, smiled immediately and said, "Yes, indeed, Monica, that's so very true, isn't it?" She looked down, thinking if she confessed that the authorities took Rhoda away and put her in some kind of semi-penal institution, there would inevitably be publicity, stories in the paper. Perhaps the situation would be considered unusual enough for printing everywhere, in newspapers and all over the country. She frowned, seeing her mind's eye the headliners that inevitably announced the story: "Bravo granddaughter, double murderer," or "Tot kills two." Once she had to put the machinery in motion, there'd be no way of avoiding the usual publicity. Monica and Emery and the Fern sisters, everybody in town, in fact, would know and pity herself and Kenneth, a thought that she found unendurable. Her husband's career would be brought to an end once more. They'd be forced to leave this place, to find another haven for themselves. Were they in, to be forever on the run, to have no peace for themselves? Must they always be the victims of their child's avarice? Mrs. Breedlove paused uncertainly and said, "My mother, who didn't have any backbone at all. She was like all the women of her day, I suppose, who agreed with everything Others suggested, particularly if the other person were a man. Yes, it's certainly an asset for a boy to be brainy. And then the visitor said, all a girl needs to get by is to be pretty. It's important for girls to be pretty. And when the visitor said that, I made up my mind I wasn't going to be pretty, even if it turned out the way naturally, which of course it didn't. She giggled, tossed her pebble over her shoulder, and looked anxiously at Mrs. Penmar, whose face was set automatically in the smile of placating falseness. She was not even aware for a moment that Mrs. Breedlove regarded her with such interest, for she was thinking that the exposure of her child's crimes would not only destroy itself and Kenneth, it would inevitably bring destruction to Kevin's mother and unmarried sisters too. They were all conventional and prudish, with no understanding of others who differed from themselves, with no forgiveness in their hearts. They'd never be able to accept the reality of a criminal Penmark. They'd blame her for a child's abnormality. She could not endure that, although the knowledge would be bitter, but her husband's situation would be even more difficult than her own. He was tied to the stodginess of his family in ways he neither realized nor admitted. His family had disliked her from the beginning. They made no secret of their resentment at his marriage. Would he not then, after the acceptance of their joint tragedy, look at her with more appraising eyes? Would he not wonder if his mother and sisters had not been writing their objections after all? She sighed again, shaking her head in helplessness. And so I say so myself, continued Mrs. Breedlove. I'm going to be as smart as any man alive, and on his terms too. She moved restively and went on. I said to myself, what do men think they are anyway? Going around like the lords of the creation. I'll show them where to get off, I said. Christine nodded in absent-minded agreement. The more she considered matters they were, the less she could see how any benefit could be had from the child's exposure at the time. Even if she were committed to a reform school, what would be accomplished in the long run by such an act? If what she'd heard about the institutions were true, the school had no doubt would only serve as the final backgrounds of the child's corruption. If indeed there was a final corruption for her to achieve. Then, looking up, feeling something was expected of her, she smiled again, making an unintelligible sound through her lips. And then said at length, Yes, I'm sure that's true, Monica. Mrs. Breedlove talked for a minute more, her voice getting less and less decisive, and then coming to the end of her involved reactions to the perfections of men, she raised her eyes and stared searchingly at Mrs. Penmark. And seeing that her friend no longer even made a pretense of listening to her, she said with humorous petulance, What's the matter with you today? You look pale and distraught. You're definitely worried about something. Who's been hurting your feelings, Christine? Who's treated you badly? She moved in her chair and thrust her legs straight before her knees tilted outward and outlined under her summer dress, the rims of her shoes resting at an ungraceful angle on the rug. Then, speaking on a high, artificial voice that one uses to placate a difficult child, she said with real concern in her voice, I'm going to be quite frank with you, dear Christine. Emery and I are concerned about you these days. We were discussing you last night at dinner, and we came to the conclusion you've not been yourself as of late. Would you tell me what's troubling you? Won't you let me help? Christine laughed disarmingly and protested in a voice which she knew fooled nobody. It's nothing, Monica. I haven't been sleeping well lately. Perhaps it's the heat. I'm not as used to it as you and Emery. You must remember, I'm not feeling up to par. Please don't worry about me. You haven't been quite the same since the day of the Fern picnic, said Monica. Emery said it last night. At first I didn't agree with him, but when I looked back, I think it's true. She waited and nodded cheerfully. Oh, well, if you don't want to tell me, you don't want to tell me. She often leave. Take your time, dear. I'm sure you'll tell me when the right comes. Christine said, There's nothing to tell at all. She walked gaily for the first time. As though in denial of Mrs. Breedlove's words that she had changed. But all the time, time she was smiling and asking questions, she kept shaking her head and inwardly saying to herself, "You're wrong. I'll never tell you or anything else about Rhoda. How could I possibly tell anyone such things?" Mrs. Penmark remained awake that night for a long time, turning nervously from side to side. But nothing morning she fell into a unique sleep, into a troubled dream. She was troubled in a white city where nobody came, although the city was full of people. A menacing sky stretched over her. The sky was strange, slipper-shaped clouds lying motionless on the horizon. She went about peering into the small houses where people live and yet did not live, and said, "I am lost, so show me the way out of this cool place." And then the city was full of people. She walked through them as easily as I walked through her. They did not speak to her or acknowledge her existence, and she said, "I am one of them, but they do not know it yet." She was tired and depressed, and she stood weeping before one of the houses which she knew to be her own. She began to run, knowing at last she knew nothing. She was only insubstantial ghost like the others, until she reached a little hill beyond the city, and rest there on top of the hill, trembling with fear. She saw a house shaped like a shoe with the name Christine Denker written across its face in Rhoda's neat hand. Collapsed with nothingness, with only gray dust rising, setting slow to where the house had been. She was close to wake in the moment, and she said, "She will destroy us all." Oh, I did not escape either. She will destroy us all in time. She awoke with her hands trembling, her nightgown wet with sweat. She got up, lit a cigarette, and stood in the dark smoking it. Then suddenly the cocks were crowing in the backyard of the poor, unpainted shacks a few blades away. She knew it was closed down. She went to her window and looked at the sky turning pink, getting pearl gray over the bayous and the intricate pattern of rivers and bays to the east. She wept suddenly, her paws on the wide ledge of red brick outside her window, and the dew had collected there and broke under her hands like blisters. And coming into her living room, she turned on her reading lamp. The light from the globe dispelled the unreal half-light of dawn. She closed the door to her daughter's room so that the typewriter would not disturb her, and then, sitting at her desk, she wrote again to her husband one of the detailed, most passionate letters she had no intention of sending him. In it, she confessed her anxiety and despair. She had insisted on knowing the truth, and now that she knew it, she could not see how this matter went with Rhoda was to end. The only comfort she could take in her knowledge was the fact that she could no longer shatter her mind with doubt. About this moment, she said she wished that she did not know, and that she could go on believing, in spite of her average common sense, in the off chance of her child's innocence. The problem was that she and Kenneth now faced, a problem she knew in its entirety, but he as of yet did not know, was one so difficult that it seemed impossible of satisfactory solution. What was their duty and future, both to their child and to the society in which they now live? She wrote, "If you were only with me, my darling, if you were only here at my side to sustain me, to advise me as what I can do, but you are not here, and I must manage as best as I can until you return. I must try to believe that Rhoda was too young to understand the things she's done. And yet other children no older than she is understand these things very, very well. Do you think, as I try to think, that she's learned her lesson, that she'll never do such things again? I've determined to think of the things I now know as little as possible. I must go on hoping that matters will somehow work themselves out in the end. I am almost lost, my darling. What do I do now? Coming back to me quickly. I want you to know now. I need you so badly. Come back to me. For God's sake, come to me quickly. I'm not nearly so brave as I pretend to be." When her letter was finished, she put her with others in her locked drawer. It was now light outside with the sun well risen, and she made coffee for herself, and she drinking it, a strange contemplative look on her face, while her mind moved restlessly in its unbroken circle of thought. She was foolish and rather presumptuous to assume she alone must take the necessary decisions concerning her child, as though only her opinions had value. No, that wasn't true. Responsibility for the child, for the joint, was it that she shared equally with Kenneth. And when his work was wound up and he was with her again, they'd talk the matters over in calmness. They draw strength from each other. They decided what they must do. But the fact, no matter what the child had done, that she saw her own flesh and blood, and plainly it was their own duty to protect the cruelty of the world. She did not know how Kenneth would feel that he too knew beyond doubt things Rhoda had done. But insofar as she was concerned, she was going to protect her child as best she could. Of course, she would look out for the welfare of others, too. She constantly watched her child to see that she harmed nobody else. Perhaps if she was distressing herself needlessly over and over these matters, perhaps such a thing would not happen now that she knew Rhoda had done, and Rhoda was aware that she knew. But no matter what the little girl was now or became in the future, she was going to protect her. That much was certain. It was her duty to protect her child. What kind of monster would she be if she planned to destroy her own child? The idea was unthinkable, and shaking her head in despair, she filled her coffee in her saucer and cried out involuntarily, "What else can I do? My God, what else can I do but protect her?" She turned her cup up to the kitchen, put it in the drain board. She turned to her chair and took up the pictures again. Yeah, although they both repelled and frightened her. She told herself that she did not actually want to read them, but now that she gunned them, she felt compulsive need to continue. She told herself in justification of her continued reading that she lived in the ignorance long enough. Perhaps if she faced reality sooner, she might have understood Rhoda better than at much earlier time, but even somewhere in her mind, she knew facile explanations to herself were only partly true, and they were not even the most important truth, for she read the cases now, in spite of the fact that she told herself she did not want to learn. Reluctant eagerness, as though knowing that when if she persisted, her words would reveal only the true enigma of her daughter's mind, but only clarify much that was in herself. Then, sighing a little, she began to read, to search diligently for the particular case she looked for, a case she had not as yet encountered. The alarm, which she set for 8, went off in the moment in her bedroom and awaking her daughter. She went about her preparations for breakfast. When from her kitchen window, she saw Leroy coming to work. When he reached the garage doors, he yawned, scratched himself, snickered, and looked up at Rhoda's window. He stood under her window and whispered, "Rhoda, little Rhoda, are you up yet?" Mrs. Penmark drew back the room so he could not see her, and then Leroy looked cautiously from side to side, said softly, Rhoda, tell me one thing. You found what you've been looking for yet?" The child gave no sign of his presence under her window, and then he turned away, laughing his mute, triumphant laugh. He said, "If you haven't found it so far, you might look harder. One thing's for sure, better not find it first." He spoke in a high whisper, one finger raised coyly to his lips. And then, his eyes fixed on the child's window, and he said, "You know what that means, don't you? If you don't know, you better sure find out." He laughed again and said, "Z." He turned toward the basement room, adding, I know you're listening to me at the back of the curtain. I know you've heard everything I've said to you. When the trial came to the breakfast room, Christine said, I heard you and Leroy talking together. What did you mean by that particular sound he kept making? You didn't hear us talking together, said the child primly. You heard Leroy talking to me. I don't talk to Leroy. What do you mean by the hissing sound he made? I don't know what he meant. Leroy's a silly man. I don't listen to Leroy more than half the time. She sat at the table and unfolded her napkin. Her face rested in trouble. Sleep still in her eyes. Then she yawned, covered her mouth daintily with her palm, picked up her spoon. Christine looked at her and thought, she has no capacity for remorse or guilt. She's entirely untroubled. And afterward, when Rhoda was in the park, Mrs. Penmark went on the cases. She paused from time to time to speculate on the mind of the criminal, to discover the lesson each taught for her own guidance. She wondered what force had caused these unusual people to become what they were. Was it the result of faulty training? Was it bad environment? Was some inborn predestined sin which could be thus modified only a little? These speculations so occupied her mind that later in the morning, she telephoned Reginald to ask her for his opinion. Reginald said for years he'd read, collected, annotated, and digested cases of the type which they were now both interested in. It seemed to him that the environment had little to do with its persistent appearance, although conceivably environment might modify its own outward aspects. The simplest way is to understand the type was to require normal human beings of 50,000 years ago, before man began his task of civilizing himself or build his code of axioms and the moral code that govern us all. In other words, most of us will not be able somehow the molding force of precept and example to develop the strange thing we call conscience, to acquire a reasonably acceptable moral character. But others did not have this ability at all, no matter what benign influences they were subjected to. They were not even able to love another except the crudest manifestations of flesh. They had mental understanding of the shadings of right and wrong, but none of them had the moral understanding of these things. They were true inborn criminals that can neither be changed nor modified. When she turned from the phone, Mrs. Penmark took up the folders and read again. She read on, but at last she came to a case marked in Reginald's hand, the unparalleled Bessie Denker. She held the folder limply in her hands, frowned, and shook her head in puzzlement at the insistent familiarity of the name. The story was by Madison Cravat, whose name was familiar to her by this time, and wrote a special sort of tittering wit so typical of his specialty. He began, now if I were commanded to pick my favorite murderess from the army of her talented sister, it would not be the bleached Eva Koo, whose name was so soft and heart was so hard. It would not be that simpering chocolate drinker, Miss Madeline Sprith, who the British so wildly adore. It wouldn't be our equally loved Lizzie Borden, who is now immortalized in Doggerel, and who is said to have perfected her technique with a hatchet through chopping off the heads of her pet kittens. It wouldn't be the handsome Lida Southard, a lady who's never received the platitudes due from her unbelieving public. It wouldn't be the saintly Anna Hahn, who, in addition to a free use of arsenic, sleeping pills, and strychnine, introduced a new lethal agent into American letters. Quite not ill of all things, my dears. No, it would be none of these artistes in the art of murder, talented though they were. My choice for first place would be the unrivaled Bessie Denker, queen of them all. Bessie Denker, who had a built-in icebox for a heart, a steel rod for a spine, and an instrument as accurate as impersonal as a competitor for a brain. I make no secret of my admiration for this endearing lady. Bessie Denker was tops in my book. We're going steady now. Bessie Denker is my sweetheart, and I don't care who knows it. At this point, Mrs. Penmark made a gesture of distaste, put aside the folders, and went about her usual task. That afternoon, needing a need to clear her mind, she took Rhoda to a movie. She sat in the darkened theater, trying to concentrate on the shallow story, but she could not. Afterwards, she and little girl went to a pastry shop for ice cream and cakes. She did not look at the cases again until that night when Rhoda was asleep, and then turning quickly to the Denker case one more, she continued to read its dreadful details. She learned that Bessie Denker had been born Bessie Scober in 1882 on a farm in Iowa, the eldest child of Heinz and Mamie Gustafson Scober. She had a little brother and little sister, both younger than herself. The little boy died from an accidental dose of arsenic, which Bessie had, in her 7-year-old innocence, spread on bread and butter, mistaking it for sugar. The little girl, while helping her sister draw a bucket of water, somehow fell in the well and drowned. Years later, when Mrs. Denker was charged with other crimes and later and on trial for life, it was said by neighbors who remembered her family at the time. Thanks to Bessie's energy and determination, it entirely stinks that her grandfather Gustafson had been shot one Sunday afternoon as he headed to his rocking chair on the back porch. Nobody knew how it happened or who had done it. Certainly at the time, nobody suspected a wide-eyed little Bessie Scober who had been alone with him and who was only 11 years old in those days. Cravat apologized for his inadequate presentation of these early speculative affairs that concerned his ideal, but if the reader wanted a more detailed picture, a truly profound study of the early years of Bessie Scober Denker, he referred to the remarkable series of articles by the late Richard Bravo, who had been reported in Mrs. Denker's trial, who had studied her life in the minutest detail, who was in fact the acknowledged author in her early antics. Mrs. Penmark's hands were sweating. They shook as she took aside the folder and lit a cigarette. She wondered why her father had never spoken of the Denker case, if he were the recognized authority on the aspects of it. As he spoke of these affairs at the time, he had played a journalistic part, or had spoken of it, and she, being uninterested, merely heard and forgotten. If the latter were true, she could understand why the names Decker, Scober, and Gustafson seemed so familiar to her now, as though she knew them all from some of the distant past. Why she could at this moment, even before she read the facts, anticipate some of the things that were happening to her later on. She did not know, and suddenly she did not want to know. She felt that she had been unwise in reading the case of calculation and cold greed. Really, they served no purpose. The whole idea had been a mistake. She read no more. But against her will, she kept remembering the Denker case and saying to herself, "There's a boy called Sonny, I think. Was his real name Luca, do you suppose? There was another boy, older than Emma, named Peter. Yes, I'm sure his name was Peter. And there was another girl, the youngest of the Denker children. But I can't remember her name now, although I certainly remember it one time." She went to the mirror and stared at herself in astonishment, thinking, "Have I lost my senses? How could I have ever known such people?" And then she told herself she read no more. She meant it this time. She returned the files to original the next morning. She would dismiss it from her mind, those implications, the struggle so strongly to be recognized. She glanced at her clock, and seeing it was after midnight, she went to bed. Although again she was restless and could not sleep, she said to herself, "How can Bessie Denker concern me? I don't know anything more about her. I have my own problems to solve." And that's the end of that chapter. Thanks for listening.